Welcome back, and we start with this breaking news that Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, both 16, can now be named as the killers of the teenager Brianna Ghey. That's after Mrs Justice Yip lifted a ban on reporting their identities before they are sentenced today for the murder of Brianna Ghey at Manchester Crown Court. You will remember that during the trial they were referred to as simply Girl X and Boy Y, and they are going to be sentenced today for the murder of the transgender schoolgirl Brianna Ghey. You'll remember that she was stabbed to death in broad daylight 28 times in a park in Cheshire in February of last year. But that breaking news in the past few moments that those two teenagers have now been named for the very first time as Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, both of them just 16 years old, and they are going to be sentenced imminently. Our reporter Sophie Reaper is there. We're going to go to that sentencing once we have it a little bit later on in the programme. But in the meantime, we are joined by our panel who can react to this breaking news. Matthew Stadlin and Russell Quirk, very good morning to you both. Matthew, this is just such a shocking case, isn't it? It shocked the nation.
Yeah, I was going to use those very words, actually. It's a case that shocked the nation, and clearly the judge here, Mrs Justice Yip, has exercised her discretion to name these children, even though they are, as we know, 16-year-olds. And I think that is because she will feel it's in the public interest, so that if there are lessons that can be learned, that awful phrase, then we can begin more effectively to learn them. And, you know, there will be families up and down the country who will look at this case and say, are we doing enough as parents to make absolutely as sure as we can that our children are never involved in such a horrific killing? I mean, as you say, it shocked the nation. There are no words to describe what the parents of Brianna have gone through and continue to go through.
Well, and of course, let's not forget this is quite an abhorrent pair. I mean, not just because of the crime that they've been convicted of in terms of the murder. We will wait and see what the sentencing is. Let's hope that is harsh, very, very harsh. Even though yes, they are children, they are monsters. You know, having committed this crime, but also having a list of potential further victims, which I believe was another 4 people. So yes, they're children, but I guess, look, you know, there are some political quarters that think 16-year-olds should be able to vote. So on the same basis, 16-year-olds that are monsters should be able to be convicted and named. I
think we're just about to get the first pictures of this pair. Hopefully, there we go.
So they have been named in the past few moments as Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, both of them 16 years old. They have been named, and these are the first pictures that we have seen of this pair. And as you were just saying there, Russell, the trial heard that these two, Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, had a thirst for killing. And the court did hear during the trial that they had a fascination with violence, torture and murder. For weeks, they'd exchanged messages about killing people and a detailed plan as well for Brianna's murder. And the judge has spoken so far, saying that she does expect to give them a very harsh sentence.
Well, let's see what harsh means in that judge's mind. I mean, look, many of us would say that they should never be released. I mean, how on earth can monsters like this ever be rehabilitated? You know, if they have, as you say, got a thirst for death and violence.
Can you understand the arguments for not releasing their identities?
No, because of the abhorrence of the crime. No, I can't. And as I say, 16, I know they're not quite adults, but if they're old enough to murder people, they're old enough to be named by the criminal justice process.
I would just say, rather than calling them monsters, it might be more helpful if our primary aim here is to prevent such horrors ever happening again, to describe the crimes as monstrous, their behaviour.
But how are they not monsters, Matt?
Well, what we need to do as parents, I'm a father, is to make sure that our children never go down that sort of route. I don't think any human being on the planet, and I may be wrong, I'm not a clinical psychiatrist, is innately evil. I think the acts that some people do are evil. I absolutely think that people need to be locked away for a very, very long time to protect society. But in order to prevent this sort of horror ever happening again, rather than just othering people, we should look at how it was possible that this ever came to happen.
The argument for not naming them comes in the fact that this pair as Ellie had alluded to a second ago, they had a kill list of children to target. They had a lust for death and murder, and they'd researched it quite in depth. The argument for not naming them was because there was concern that if you did, they would gain satisfaction out of the notoriety from what they've done. So can you, just going back to my previous question, can you not sympathise with that part of the argument?
No, because
we're not just giving them what they want?
As the judge has clearly got in their mind, it is in the public interest for us to know. I mean, the opposite of that, the counter of this would now, us having seen this crime play out and the sentence and so on, and the media to be discussing it and debating it as we are, for us not to know who that was, I think would be an injustice. Of course it's in the public interest for us to know. And look, sorry, I think we've also, no disrespect to Matt, we've got to start thinking about victims here and protecting society from such people, so from the assailants, rather than always thinking about how we might rehabilitate, how we might get to the nub of how this stuff happens.
I haven't actually talked about rehabilitation, although I do believe in rehabilitation. I've actually talked about how we prevent there being further victims like Brianna. And all I'm saying is that rather than casting individual human beings as monsters, it is more helpful, I think, to look at what they've done as monstrous, of course punish them for the monstrosity that they've done, but look at ourselves as a society and do our very, very best to make sure this never happens again. By othering people,
yeah, Matt, one surefire way of making sure that these two do not reoffend is to make sure they go to prison forever, rather than these continuing cases that we hear of people committing these crimes, going to prison for a shortish period of time and coming out and recommitting crimes.
Matt,
now,
do you think these two, Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, do you think they can be rehabilitated at some point?
I'm not an expert on rehabilitation. You would hope so, but I couldn't possibly say for sure.
Why take the chance?
Well, I do want to add in a little bit of context here, because we have just had slightly more information on these individuals from the PA news agencies. The media were banned from naming this pair, Scarlett Jenkinson and Eddie Ratcliffe, for the duration of the trial because of their age. That has now been lifted by the trial judge, Mrs Justice Yip. Furthermore, Eddie Ratcliffe, has been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and is non-verbal. And Scarlett Jenkinson has been diagnosed with traits of autism and ADHD. Does that diagnosis of that pair change your thoughts on them being named today, Matthew?
Listen, it's really difficult for us, and I always say this, sitting in a studio in London or wherever we may be and double guessing the judgment of a judge. This judge has sat through this case, listened to all the evidence. She has taken into account exactly what you've just said, presumably, Ellie, but also has weighed against that the public interest, and she's come to her conclusion. So it'd be really tricky, and I'm not sure particularly helpful, for me to say that she's got it wrong one way or the other.
Matt, you said let's not refer to this pair as monsters, but Brianna's father, Peter Spooner, he has said in the last couple of minutes, if I'm honest, I hate them both. They're just evil for what they've done to my daughter, and I don't think they'll ever change. They'll always be monsters, and that's what they are to me.
Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me at all, and I wouldn't criticise him for saying that. As I said in my very first response to this, what Brianna's parents, and I saw her father talk about this after the conviction, but obviously we haven't got to sentencing yet, and it is absolutely heartbreaking to watch him speak. As a father myself, how could one ever criticise that sort of response? It is entirely understandable, and I'm sure, God forbid, anything would happen to any of our children, or any of the children watching, we'd have a very similar reaction.
And Russell, you're a father of teenage girls as well.
Yes.
How do you respond to Brianna's father's comments there?
Well, I think every father would respond in the same way. You can understand the hatred, I guess, and the angst. It's just a natural reaction. The other aspect to this, of course, with regard to naming, is that one of the rules of natural justice is that justice not only has to be done, it has to be seen to be done. That is a very, very important tenet to our criminal justice
Well, Russell, actually, Brianna's dad, he went on in his comments, he disagrees with you and the judge naming this pair.
He's changed his mind, hasn't he?
He's changed his mind. He said, at first, I thought they should be named. Why should they be protected? People should know who they are. Now, I think their names are always going to be tied to Brianna's all the time. I think they should just be forgotten about, locked up, and not be spoken of again. They're nothing. That's quite interesting, isn't it, that he has changed his mind?
Yes, look.